Um, Hope you're well. Hope you've been transitioning into autumn with some ease. My name is Nishma. I'm a facilitator, organizer, mediator. I'm also Saturday School producer with Migrants in Culture. This is our third and final autumn talk as part of Saturday School. Saturday School is a creative learning lab for migrant organizers to imagine, embody, and design for border abolition. I think Saturday School is really rooted in the recognition that as we organize, as we campaign to mitigate for harm from multiple hostile environments, we also need to be designing and building the community infrastructures and relationships that we want that replace borders, that are more, I guess, that more compellingly demonstrate that borders are in fact unnecessary. Um, I think this really, really requires, as you would have heard in our previous two talks, it really requires us to get good at experimenting, at learning how to resource our experiments and really sustaining ourselves and our movements for that long-term possibility of creation, of creativity. Um, as you heard in the last two conversations, this is really, really challenging, really hard work. And we've been inviting our wonderful speakers throughout this series into conversation to explore how do we experiment and how do we hold long and bold visions whilst also building our futures in the present. So today I'm going to be speaking with Shana Agid. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you, Shana. Thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning as well, your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with y'all.
Amazing. So I'll do a bit of an introduction, but we're going to be in conversation, so you will learn much more about Shana's work through that as well. Um, so Shana is an artist, designer, teacher, and organizer whose work focuses on relationships of power and difference in visual, social, and political cultures. His design work focuses on exploring possibilities for making self-determined infrastructures and campaigns through teaching and design research. She's also a book artist and a letterpress printer. Shana is an associate professor of arts, media, and communications at Parsons School of Design, a longtime member of Critical Resistance, and the Transformative Justice Skill Up Fellow at Interrupting Criminalization for 2024 to 2026. So we're going to be in conversation for about the next sort of 40-ish minutes about what it means to rehearse abolition. And then I'll try to safeguard some time for you all to ask questions as well. I will just share that today we're in webinar mode, so we can only see each other. We can't see you all. So it'll be really, so a little bit feels like we're just speaking in private, but we know you're all there. And we really, really welcome your comments in the chat. If you have questions, thoughts, reflections, please put them into the Q&A function as well. We'll get to those at the end. And I'll just say that we do have a few slides that we'll be sharing at some point to talk through some of the really exciting experiments that we'll be looking at. And yeah, a final quick note to say that this is being recorded, and you can also turn on the closed captions at the bottom Zoom panel. And yeah, that's it. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And I guess let's get into it. I guess just first of all, I guess, how are you, Shana? How are you doing early in the morning today?
Thank you. I'm super excited about the work you all are doing, which sounds like a canned cheesy answer, but it's the truth. So I'm really happy to be here. I spent my day yesterday trying to build a table. I'm trying to learn how to build some furniture for a studio, and that was exciting. So I'm the state of the world notwithstanding, I am doing things that are making each day all right.
Thank you. That sounds beautiful. Yeah, I guess I'll start with asking you a little bit about your journey into this work of rehearsing abolition and what that means to you.
Um, I will confess that I got to see these questions ahead, and this was a really interesting thing for me to think about. And I think there are two pieces to this, and I think the rehearsing piece of it is really, it's to me a really critical part to be thinking about. But I just nuts and bolts, I came to abolition work through Critical Resistance, which is a largely US-based organization that has done work with folks internationally over the last 25 years or so. But I started working with CR in 1999 on my birthday, actually, just because my birthday, I think, is International Human Rights Day. So I'm often at a thing on my birthday. And I got invited to be part of an organizing meeting for what became a follow-up conference to the original convening that was in Berkeley, California in 1998. And I got involved in organizing Critical Resistance East. And this was at a point where folks who had been at the 98 conference felt like it was important to continue the conversation that started there. And that 98 Critical Resistance Conference, for folks who are not familiar, and I don't expect anyone would be, was organized by a group of people who were beginning to see the sort of ways that that racism, capitalism, both gendered violence, but also gender discrimination were sort of coming together and coalescing in an unprecedented explosion of imprisonment in the United States. And so it was during a period where the number of prisons that were being built, the way that the police were operating in particular ways, and the numbers of people locked up just started to skyrocket. And there are many different theories about sort of exactly why and how this happened, but much of what people have argued subsequently is that this was a combination of responses to the uprisings of the 1960s and 70s, to longtime organizing that people were doing, and also to the economics of the era of the moment, and a sort of ongoing pattern of in the United States of criminalizing Blackness in particular, and folks of color, migrants, queer folks, and others. So as a person who is white, middle class, but queer and trans identified, queer identified at the time, I had a lot to learn, and was not at the time strongly identified as an abolitionist. And so I became I had a lot of questions, but I had been working at that point for the better part of my life with in HIV and AIDS organizing, and I'd been working with young people as a young person when I was a young person. I was working as a peer educator with people who were street involved and also people who were locked up, and many of the things that I witnessed when I was doing that work in the late 80s and early 90s. Was the level of fundamental control that the state, in the person of the people who worked in the jails and prisons that we were going into, had over the young folks who we were really just trying to have conversations about healthy relationships and how to say yes to the things you wanted to and say no to the things you didn't want to, mostly around sex and people's own bodies. And I think for me, that was the beginning of starting to see what happened when the when punishment essentially took charge of people's ability to keep themselves safe. And so I think I might not have articulated it that as in that way at the time, but by the time I came to CR, I was working with HIV positive prisoners in New York State. And what I saw was my main job was to try to get people their medications. And what I saw over and over and over again was not only that the prison was not keeping people safer, but that it was putting people in just incredible danger constantly. So I think I came to understanding that making better prisons was not a way to address what I saw, sort of experientially through that work and through the education with elders and other folks my age who I met through Critical Resistance. And through that began to really learn, I think, or maybe unlearn, that policing in prisons were inevitable, and also began to kind of unlearn the idea that when people do harm, something bad needs to happen to them, and began to ask a lot of questions about what else could happen. The very last thing I'll say on this is that in doing all that HIV work, the world that I came out into in the late 80s, early 90s was a world that was already defined by a lot of people dying in a state like in a state of the world where the government cared very little about it and was doing everything that they could to kind of act like it wasn't happening. And so the world quite literally that I came out into as a queer person was one where queer women were getting trained up to figure out how to take care of queer men and other queer women as they were dying. And so the world I came out into was one that was shaped by this need to create the ability to take care of one another in these sort of really critical ways at really critical times, and to do it with a combination of humor and gravity. And I think that that shaped me deeply in my understanding kind of what we have to build in order to imagine where we want to go.
Well, thank you so much, Shana. I really appreciate you also foregrounding your work with folks who are imprisoned and this idea that, building better prisons, or even now that our government at the moment is proposing, I think they're calling them like rehabilitation centers. I'm not sure, I've forgotten the language they're using, but like that's the proposal that's being put forward. And just like that's not the direction we want to be going in. So I really appreciate that. And I really hear what you're sharing about actually people have been experimenting, building with how we take care of each other for a long, long time, way before us, and will continue into the future. Maybe we didn't use that language. Maybe we were doing it because we just needed to survive, and we had to have people around us that could support us to do that, or to be taken care of. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that in as the kind of foundation where you entered this work. Um, I guess I know that we know each other from some collaborative work we've been doing, which we'll talk about. And I know and I see this commitment you have towards designing and building infrastructures of practice for us all. And in particular, I know you've been thinking quite deeply about what is needed for us to be able to practice transformative justice in our lives, and what does that look like. Would you be up for telling us a little bit more about some of the experiments, the TJ experiments that you have tried out or are trying out now, and what they kind of required, I guess?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna if y'all don't mind, I'm gonna share my screen real quick so that I can share a few things with you, if you'll bear with me. Um, and I'm just gonna make this be a slideshow. There we go. Can everybody see that? And Nishma, I think I'm mostly asking you because I can
Yeah,
only see.
that's perfect. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna just walk through briefly a couple of ideas here. Thank you, Nancy, in the chat. I appreciate you. So there are a couple of so oftentimes when we get introduced to this work, we're asked two different things. One is like, prove it, like prove to us that you can do this, that there's some other thing, right? So the example I often use of this, and I say this with deep love and respect for my mother, for whom I have deep love and respect. When my mom was a judge, and I grew up in a family of lawyers, and the kinds of conversations that I had with my mom about abolition after I started thinking about it were transformational for me on multiple counts. But one of the most challenging things she ever said to me, which I think is a question lots of people who do this work get asked by someone, usually someone they care about, was, well, what if someone killed me? And I was like, dang, wow, okay, that's heavy. But I've thought about it, that was now 2 decades ago at least. And I've thought about it on a regular basis ever since then. And I say this now to say that I think in some ways this idea of rehearsing, of trying to understand my conditioned responses, and not just mine, right? What we're socialized to believe is what you do in an instance like that, or what you don't do. Um, are really conditioned by a set of limitations, right, that are imposed by this belief that policing and prisons are the things we turn to in instances of incredible loss or huge anger and rage, right? I mean, because my real answer to my mom is like, I'm not sure you want to know, because if I knew who that person was, right, in that moment, I was like, the kind of rage I would feel, I don't know. I don't know what I would do, right? And so for me, a lot of this has to do with finding ways to answer those kinds of fundamental questions for ourselves. Like, so for me, that's one of my fundamental questions. And my mom has since passed away, not at a person's hand. But but I still think about it all the time because I think about, when people hurt people that I love deeply and that happens, what do I have to turn to, right? And what do I want to have to turn to? And I would argue that everything we make can't only be motivated by ourselves, but I think we can be good touch points for ourselves to think about, both what we can imagine and also what we struggle with. So with that in mind, I wanted to show just a couple of things. I think that the work that I have been doing for the last several decades or a couple decades has been, I just aged myself there, a couple decades at least, has been largely about sort of the simultaneity of organizing to tear down or counteract or fight against prisons and policing and the ways that they are leveraged. And then the sort of simultaneously to think about, okay, well, if we are working to make these things obsolete, what are we building? Not so much instead. And I think Mariam Kaba and many others have really great ways of talking about the limitations of thinking only in terms of alternatives. That if we imagine there's one system that we're looking for the one alternative that will replace that system, we tend to fall into a trap over and over. But it's really at the spaces where we can't imagine what that alternative is. And for me, like when I think about borders, this is what happens where I'm like, I've only ever lived in a world that has these nation state borders. And yet I know the nation state borders produce a form of violence that will not stop until those borders do not exist. And so if I can, how do I begin to imagine what that looks or feels like? And these to me feel like really important challenges, right? To be able to begin thinking about how to make them obsolete. So that both and of kind of fighting those structures and imagining and building these other things. And so I'm going to just run through these couple of slides. What you're looking at on the screen right now are a couple of screenshots and a website that I highly recommend folks go check out. This is a project that comes out of some of the work I've been doing with Eva Nagao and Mariam Kaba through Interrupting Criminalization and Project NIA. And this is work they've done that I have mostly been around watching while I've been doing other things, but I find really exciting, which is a project called 1 Million Experiments. And it's a direct sort of way to try to address that idea that there's not going to be one alternative. It's going to take 1 million experiments, right? And many of them will fail and or fade out or seed other things and disappear. And I think this is a huge piece of what is important for us to think about. So this is just a quick way. I encourage everyone to go take a look at this. One of the things that Million Experiments does is also collect experiments from people, and there's a whole area there about how to submit an experiment. But the idea here is beginning to build an understanding across these kinds of different categories that you see at the bottom of all these different types of projects, essentially projects, organizing campaigns, community funds, things like that, that people are building in order to either resist systems that are oppressive, to ameliorate their impacts, to just work around them altogether. And as has come up in the previous Saturday school sessions, this stuff is not new, right? People learn this from their neighbors, from their elders, from their family members. And these things often come up and start to happen as the need emerges. But each of them gives us practice at how do you organize something with other people? How do you get resources to meet the needs that you're seeing? How do you get those resources organized to actually meet the needs in a way that is respectful? And so all of this is practice for what we're talking about. So that's one thing I wanted to share, and I really do encourage people to check it out. There's also a podcast that's super helpful to listen to, because part of what people do in the podcast and in other parts of the site is literally break down, what did we do? Why did we do it? How did we come to it, right? So it's not staying on the kind of like, isn't this a great idea tip, but it gets more into the nuts and bolts of things. So this is an example from a a project that I worked on for a long time with critical resistance in Oakland, California. This was something I worked on from afar as part of design research that I actually do, but I was also working as an organizer with the group. And the short version of this story, which I'm happy to tell a longer version of at some point, is that through a process of talking with folks in the aftermath of a very successful, very complex citywide coalition-based campaign to end these civil instruments called gang injunctions that limited largely Black and brown people's ability to move around. Anyone who was identified as quote unquote a gang member through this gang index. I don't know if y'all have this in the UK. Yes. There was a hugely successful campaign, and folks were like, well, what do we do now, right? We won this massive campaign. We ended these gang injunctions. We built all this community, and we built this organizing power. And one of the things that critical resistance decided to do in conversation with allies was to find out what else people wanted, right? What else might we build? What were some of the trouble points? And one of the things that got identified through that process of talking with people was that there was a sort of serious issue people identified that when you called for emergency medical help, the police either always came or almost always came. And there were a number of sort of things that came with that, everything from people who were injured not actually getting proper medical care to it putting people at risk when what they were trying to do was get help, right? So we began to organize with folks in Oakland to identify things that we could make and do that could, toward the long-term goal of making policing obsolete in Oakland, that in the short term could just keep police out of people's neighborhoods and communities. And so we started developing what ultimately became called Know Your Options workshops. And this structure to me is really interesting because the idea was not that we can necessarily make the police go away today, but we can know our options for not having them come into our house, our community, our building, our office, workplace. And how do we begin to build around knowing your options? And so this is just one example of one of the things that got made through that process. Which was literally other ways to think about what phone numbers to call if there was an emergency that was a medical emergency, for instance, or a fire emergency, and to also begin to educate folks about what that 911 structure, when you call the emergency number, what actually happens. And on the flip side of this is just a little palm card. On the flip side of this are just some really sort of straightforward tips you can take for de-escalating in the moment. And we built, not we, I was not there for this, but the CR group built a number of workshops around this and would go around and get invited to different kinds of community organizations and spaces as they were developing police no-call policies or practices. So this was a big piece of, in this post gang injunction moment, in a moment in Oakland where people really wanted police out of their spaces. These were concrete tools that people could use to do that. This is an image that we can come back to, but just to sort of talk about how these things kind of come together. This is from my my research work. As Nishma said, I'm a designer and I work in a weird field called service design that actually grows really out of like some of the worst kinds of marketing. Like if you think about when you walk into a chain store, how everyone is wearing the same thing and it all looks the same and everything's organized the same way and they say the same things to you. That is sort of the marketing version, a sort of marketing version of service design, which is how do you make your service one that people want to buy. But what's fascinating to me about service design is when it's used, and many designers have done this in different ways, when it's used toward thinking about how people organize socially to meet needs they have with resources they can identify, it begins to become this really interesting way to think about building infrastructure. And so I've gotten really interested in that in thinking about abolitionist work. But if we think about infrastructures really as things that we have more control over than we tend to think about. This is one way that I like to think about this role of experiments and rehearsals in working as an abolitionist with people in their day-to-day lives. And so if we think about And I'll say this really quickly, the prison industrial complex, which is this large structure that I've been talking about, and Nishma, you've also spoken about in relationship to prisons, policing, borders, surveillance, sort of this these intersecting components of government and industry that really center policing and punishment as a way of kind of addressing all social problems or social concerns. If we think about that as this one sort of large scale overarching infrastructure that we're constantly engaging with in various ways, if we think about abolitionist organizing as like another infrastructure, right? Something that's engaging with that in the immediate, but also sort of envisioning other things in the long term. And then down in the bottom right, this idea of having imagined infrastructures, right? What are the things we're trying to build? What are those abolitionist things that we actually already are making and doing? That if we think about those things in relationship to each other as actively making and unmaking things in relationship to one another, these experiments and rehearsals that we're talking about, I would argue, sort of sit somewhere in the middle and are real things, right? They're not sort of a flash in the pan or an experiment in the sense that that it's not going to work, but an experiment in the sense that each of them is actually hashing out this little bit of infrastructure that we're building, like this little thing that we're creating. Sometimes they're seeds, sometimes they get bigger, but really this kind of intersection of the pieces that will displace as opposed to replace something like the prison industrial complex. So with that, I'm hoping my next slide is what I think it is. Yes. So I'm hoping actually just to invite us back into an actual conversation here, I'm hoping we could talk about this. So this is this project that Nishma and I have both been working on really for the last like 3 some years now. And it's a project that is called the Transformative Justice Skill Up Institute, or now just the Transformative Justice Skill Up. And it grew out of questions that were coming up again and again and again, just super persistent questions about how do people who want to know how to de-escalate a conflict that they're seeing among strangers or manage a conflict in their own organizations or workplaces differently, or are seeing things fall apart around them and really want to be able to help support healthier relationships or sort of being able to kind of keep us together in the struggles that we're in. Everything from that to how do I deal with it? This happens not in where I currently live, but in my former apartment building. What happens when I hear the neighbors upstairs shouting and I'm worried that somebody might get harmed, right? Like these kinds of things that I think happen in a lot of our lives. Or what happens when, someone close to me tells me that they're, experiencing harm in a relationship. What can I do? And so we started developing first a sort of live, if you will, it was online, 8-week institute, which Nishma, you were part of, to try to give people practice space and learning space. And then out of that, or as part of that, we created a workbook that was really meant to focus on how do you get people to practice, like not just read or not just show up to the one thing, but like what's that in between work, right? That like how can we structure it so people are really like engaging with this on a regular basis in relatively low stakes ways. And so out of that, we've been building something that we're looking forward to launching in 2025, which is meant to be widely available to people who are interested in learning about, thinking about, but most importantly, practicing with others, doing this kind of conflict transformation or sort of what we call kind of basic transformative justice skill building. So Nishma's been part of some of this. What we've been working on most recently is thinking about what is this, like, how do we create a learning space that actually gets people to practice with other people? And I don't know, would you be willing, Nishma, maybe to take it from here and dive in a little about what that has been like and what you've been doing with it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I just wanted to I really love that. We can probably go back to it, but I love that framing that you had of experiments, rehearsing, and then everything around it. I think it goes back to something that we've discussed before about how we sort of hold that long-term vision of abolition of the prison industrial complex while also building in the short term. So I really appreciated that framing, and I'm sure others did too. So thank you for that. Yeah, and then in relation to the TJ Skill Up, yeah, I guess I got I participated in a sort of training, an online training And I start there because even that, even the TJ Skill Up training online in around 2020, I remember it distinctly because it was unique in that it required, while information was shared with us about, how we might intervene as a bystander or how we might mediate a conflict in our street or in our building. People shared their experiences and some models and structures for how that's possible. So much of it was about us practicing in groups, like taking a little break out and practicing that. What does it feel like? What does it look like? With case studies, with examples that were close enough to be like, oh yeah, that's happened in my building or that's happened in my collective, but also were not live for us in that moment. So, and you say this all the time, Shana, which is like that kind of, what does it mean to practice in this low stakes way, so that we can embody that learning, so that we know that this is a possibility for us. It's something that we're like, oh yeah, we do have that skill, we do have some of those relationships, as the diagram is showing on the screen. So that, right, as you said right at the beginning, we're not only moving towards what we're conditioned to do, but we're like, hey, there are some other options here. There's something else available to us, in the same way that you all did in the project around calling, when you call 999 Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that has been such a big thing for me, and why I chose to continue being involved in the TJ Skill Up, and thinking about what does it mean to do things, and we've been doing it in pairs, as part of this kind of testing stage. But what does it mean to practice together? And I liked how you said it, as you called it in between work, and it really struck me because there have been for a long time now lots of spaces where you can go and you can learn some language, you can learn some skills. We have so many know your rights workshops over here, happening so regularly because of some amazing people, and we have some really incredible education workshops and things. But actually, what does the in between work look like, and how can we build gentle support for that to be possible? So something that people can go to. So I really like, we've been working with these workbooks, right, which will come out, as you said, in 2025. So I really love that, because it was something that I could continually go back to and be like, hey, let's do this little bit together this week, let's try this out. And of course we only get to 2 pages or 1 page because so much is flourishing, so much that we also, in our organizing, I'm part of some organizing collectives, and like so much that we think we know, that we think we've spoken about, that we think we know about each other, but actually we've never said out loud. We've never said it out loud. We've never had a moment to talk about what would we do if this happened? What would we do if that occurred? And it was interesting the first time, a couple of years ago. I'm so bad at timing, so I apologize. But when I was first introduced to the workbook online, and we were looking at it, and me and the person I was paired with, we were going through it, and we're like, let's practice it, let's see what it feels like. And it just so happened that in the collective I was part of, we were actually going through multiple conflicts at that time, and actually using this infrastructure for TJ that's on the screen right now, thinking about relationship skills and structures, was invaluable. Just thinking through that. And it just happened, I had these conflicts live happening, so we're like, let's use that, let's try. And also in kind of safe way, because my partner was not part of that collective, so we were kind of thinking about it together. And it also got me to name things that maybe I was making lots of assumptions around within the collective. And so yeah, it was really helpful to have a structure, to have something to think about. And then when I was able, a few months later, to go back to the collective, where we were moving through that conflict together, and thinking about process and who we can draw upon, actually I could think about, what are the skills we have together? What are some of the structures we can lean on, or relationships we can bring in? And we did that. We brought in people from different spaces, that we had strong relationships with, to support us through those 2 or 3 conflicts we were going through. And it wasn't perfect. And I want to say that it wasn't perfect. It wasn't that like, oh, we fixed everything, we just have this one structure that works so well. It wasn't like that, but it was significantly different from the panic that often we feel when we don't know what else is possible. And then we can default back to, as an example, in this collective, we might have defaulted back to being like, okay, people need to leave and they're not able to come back, and we've just lost some comrades and people that we work with. And actually we were able to really commit using this structure. And I can say that now, as part of that collective, people are still part of it. We're still grappling with things, we're still moving through, some of the challenges, but actually we're still together, we're still working at it. And I think this gave us, I guess, confidence and um something, I guess, something to help us stay, something, because it's hard work, right? It's really, really hard. Like, it's difficult to sit in that discomfort of conflict. It's challenging to kind of be in a room together and know that we disagree or we're in conflict, but we're also organizing together, and we also have these bigger visions for the world that we're committed to. So actually having a bit of a structure around that to support us. As an example, I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but we've recently implemented, through a learning from another collective, these quarterly maintenance meetings where we can meet and we can talk about things that are troubling us or that are not sitting right with us in the collective, but that we just haven't had time to talk about because of our organizing work. So we're just this week, I think on Friday, we're going to do our first one. And that's another little structure that we're kind of relying on to be like, let's try it out. Let's see how it works for us. Maybe it won't. So yeah, that's been my experience in terms of experimenting and knowing that it's not going to be perfect, but being really grateful for people sharing on that knowledge, and also honoring, I guess, honoring where that work comes from. For me, I know that in the first training in 2020, a lot of the people that inputted to that and the work that was done was, it was skills and tools that people had developed over time as survival strategies. I know that so many people who are involved in CR and interrupting criminalization are people that have been doing this work for decades and decades, and just, people didn't know about it. And so just, I think practicing is honoring what they're passing on to us and allowing us to use as well. And like in our context, adapting to our context. So yeah, those are some of my reflections, but I'm sure you have many more as well, Shana.
No, it's so great. I wrote down a bunch of things you were saying because I think we are trying to figure out like, I mean, to me, so much of what we're talking about right now, right, is like, how do we also learn from what we're making and doing, right? So that we're building on those things, just as you've just said, right? What does it mean when someone who has been doing this work for a long time, or for whom culturally, right? Like, and we talk a lot about how there's a lot of there are ways in which there will be sort of like a sort of an appropriationist way of picking up like, oh, I heard that this culture does X, like let's try that out, right? Like, or a set of assumptions about, that really play on either gendered or racist assumptions about sort of why things happen in, say, an indigenous community in the United States, and what is now called the United States versus the way that it's organized by the actual US government, for instance, rather than actually meeting with people, talking with people, learning from people in grounded ways. And I think part of what you're naming too is that so much of what you're talking about has to do with um, learning with humility. And also, so there's both like learning from our elders and learning from folks who are willing to share learning and ideas and practices over time outside their own communities. But I also think a big part of it is being able to say, like, we don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try. Right. And I think part of it is, you know, is getting comfortable with the idea that we are going to commit to trying a thing that we don't know exactly how it's going to go. And in fact, we may falter. We might falter in ways that are big, which is part of why in the Skill Up, for instance, but I think in a lot of these, in a lot of the work that I've recently been doing, what I've seen modeled uh, is, and we did this with the Skill Up Institute, is that you start by saying, if something goes sideways, if you feel that you are being harmed by something someone has said, if you are just uncomfortable with something someone has said, here's who you talk to, here's how we're going to do that, right? So setting that stuff up from the outset, which, when then I think about other spaces I'm in, my workplace, whatever, I'm like, wow, I cannot imagine us doing that, right? Like, and I wonder how it would be different if we did. So I think it's really interesting to and important to point out like the way that you're pointing to taking risks, taking time. Um, I mean, I think what you just said about your collective is particularly important and interesting. Like the urgency of the organizing work people are doing make it very hard to stop when there hasn't been like an active thing where you're like, oh, we have to drop everything and deal with this bad thing that happened or this thing that's popping off, to actually then be able to say, we're gonna take time to really think about how, to check in about this, to see what skills we have, to see if there are other things that we need or want to draw on. And I think you pointed to this image that's on the screen a couple of times, and this is something that we made sort of through thinking about the skill up and thinking about the people who are all doing this work already. And a big part of what we started sort of thinking about, Miriam and Eva and I were meeting, we were talking about, what are we making? What are we trying to build? What does it seem like people are asking for? And Miriam noted that Kazu Haga had written about this idea of these three, we made it into a stool, but these three interlocking kind of components of doing conflict transformation work: relationships, skills, and structures. And in our thinking about it and thinking about what does it mean to try to build based on learning what we can about these where we are, was this idea of this stool that if you're sort of consistently working on thinking about building around these three things, that it actually, that those three things become kind of the legs of this larger infrastructure. So thinking about like when a thing happens, or when I'm afraid a thing might be happening, or when I've heard about something, or when my friend calls me and says, this just happened, I don't know what to do. So much of what we're talking about is everybody having at least one person they could call to be like, this is happening, I need help thinking through it. Right? Like, what would it look like if each of us just had one person we could call, who had maybe some skills we couldn't already offer, or some links to some relationships that we didn't already have? What happens when we get to know those things? And what happens when alongside that, we have the space to do exactly what you're talking about, which is build up those capacities.
And I wanted to say also, like, what would it look like for that, not like for us not to lean into the capitalistic like ideas of experts and only some people being those people that you can call, right? But like, what does it look like to distribute that and for different people in our communities to bring different things? So, because I've noticed this trend towards like wanting to call an expert when there's a conflict, and I've been sitting with it a little bit because it's interesting. I don't think those of us who are in the space of trying to think about conflict, think about TJ, think about process and community would ever consider ourselves experts, or knowing that we can walk into any situation and just know the answer or know which way to go. And so what does it mean to kind of hold that collectively and also hold that responsibility collectively too, and create together over time? So yeah, I wanted to add that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that part that is so critical. I mean, as you're saying that too, I'm thinking about like that's the idea that it works well to leave it to someone else. I mean, I think even in kind of mainstream writing about anti-violence work or gender-based violence, so much of what we see is that when people who have experienced violence at the hands of a partner or a stranger or what have you, are in the position of then sort of trying to work within the sort of policing and imprisonment structure. So often, even just the ability to be expert in one's own experience is stripped from you, right? And I think, I say this having walked through this with people who are trying to figure out what is available to them, who are trying to figure out how to address the harm that has happened to them or to a loved one, and who end up with not only not sort of being able to, feel resolution or what have you, which I know is sort of the promise of the state oftentimes, but who end up feeling like they are not that they have to defer to the experts in that system. And I think for us to remember that our goal is not to just produce different experts, right, or a different system or a different way of monitoring or managing people, that and this is, I mean, we have our work cut out for us to unlearn those things. But I do think that, I know I started out by saying this, but I think reflecting on what I learned coming out as a 14-year-old into a very politically active queer culture. I came out kind of going to ACT UP meetings and Women's Action Coalition meetings, where in turn a lot of the white people who were putting themselves in positions of leadership in those spaces were getting challenged meaningfully by folks of color and working class folks to say, like, this is not just about taking the privileges that you have and the way that you know how to operate in the world and then sort of enacting them on this instance, right? This sort of mass death that is spectacular and different to you, right? For many of us, this is what we live with every day. This is a new version of it, but this is what we live with all the time. And I think for me as a 14-year-old sort of coming into that space, watching people navigate that, it was challenging me to learn about my privilege in those moments. But I think it also, for me, solidified this idea that when we stand up for one another, we have to do that from a place where we are actively learning all the time. Like, the goal is not to be the expert. The goal is to be always asking questions and always open to educating ourselves and always open to teaching things to other people. Not necessarily, and I want to be careful in saying this, I'm not saying that, like, as a white person, I deserve to learn from the folks of color in the space who needed to take their time educating me. I don't mean that. What I mean is that there's a collective sort of way of saying, if we are going to not die together, we are going to need to learn things together. And that involves challenging ourselves to see where we have privilege. That involves challenging ourselves to learn things that are scary. And it also involves, being willing to acknowledge that we're going to get it wrong a lot. And our best efforts are going to go into making sure that we are looking out for one another in ways that are making front and center a deep understanding of the structures in which we're working and the violences that they cause, while simultaneously finding ways to support, sustain, and love one another. And it sounds, cheesy in its own way to say it, but I actually think that has, there are revolutionary aspects to just presuming that you have the ability and I don't normally talk in terms of rights, but sort of the, that we deserve to have that kind of security. And when we find ways to make it for one another, we're doing that work. We're doing that kind of building work.
Thank you so much, Shana. Really, really, really rich reflections coming through. I'm aware of the time, so I wanted to just sense check. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A or in the chat, but in case anybody wanted to add anything now, I'm very open to that. Otherwise, I do have a few questions I can ask myself. Always have questions, but just wanted to check. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I'm keeping an eye on both. And maybe I'll give you all a minute to do that. And yeah, and if not, that's okay too. But yeah, I'll give you a minute to do that, and maybe in the meantime I'll ask a question that I feel is like flowing from this piece of the conversation a little bit, which is that I think we reflected a little bit when we spoke earlier in the week. Oh, I can see a question. Let me thank you, Ali. I'll you can see it, but I'll read what it says. So Ali said, great session. I'm looking forward to having closer engagement with these resources. It would be great to have a decentered, i.e. beyond London, UK resource bank with some of the types of organizations available to us. Yeah, I really, really appreciate you bringing that in, Ali. It reminds me of I guess a conversation with a friend where we were trying to think about support structures and things beyond the police in a certain situation, and it was outside of London, and it was really, really interesting. It really like shone a light on how much we're centering a lot of what we're building in the city in London. I guess it connects to the question I was going to ask as well, which is that this idea, this kind of reflection that we've discussed around abolition, and I'm sure this happens in the States as well, in the UK, being the experiments in abolition kind of being a scattering of these small scale things that people are doing with varying degrees of success, and not really designed in a way that's connecting up with each other or with the wider systems. And I was just wondering how you think, and maybe thinking from your design experience as well, but how do you think we can better design that, and what would that what could that look like? The ingredients for creating that kind of safe, supported, resourced space and context to do these experiments in a way that we can still stay connected to one another, and connected to the wider long-term vision as well. If you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to say, like, as y'all figure it out, please keep sharing. But I think, so I would say two things. I think one, and this is a tension that I think comes up a fair amount, probably in all of our work, right? Is that working to scale is complicated, because I think in part because what gets valued about scale is the idea that you make one thing and then it works everywhere, right? And then exactly what you just named is that, like, really what we need are things that are super local in lots of ways, and yet there are elements that we can learn. And so I think this is such a great question, and I think part of, Ali, what your question puts forward, and what you've just named, Nishma, is that um, the actual place where things are happening is really important. Like, that locatedness and situatedness is really important, right? And when I think, sometimes we think about that in terms of our own sort of social or political identities, but I think that when we imagine sort of, I mean, Oakland's a great example. Like, every locality, at least in the US, but I would say this is true culturally in different places, even if it's not technically in terms of the government, manages like what happens when you call that emergency number differently, right? So in the US at least, there are places where there are laws where if someone makes a call for a domestic violence call, there's a requirement that police arrest everybody involved, regardless of who has been reported to do the harm, right? So that's a law in certain places. That's not the law in every place. But if you don't know about that law, and you are encouraging someone to call the police because someone is abusing them, right? So there are these really important sort of pieces that are about knowledge sharing. So I think the local component to me that's really important, from an organizing perspective, I think it becomes really important. Let's say if one is based in the city and then is working with folks in either other cities or more rural areas around, to get to know each other's, like, to literally get to know the legal landscape, I think can be really important, right? What do the cops do where you are? What do they do where we are? How are the courts working? If those are areas that you're navigating, right? If you're working with folks who are facing violence, for instance, those can be really, really important things to know and to share resources around. I think breaking down in the way that we might always, like, with organizing, like breaking down the components of, like, what are the threats people are facing, what are the opportunities people have, right? What are the ways in which what are the kinds of tools people have identified as being useful? So as you're experimenting, being able to, through those relationship kind of networks that you're building, I don't mean like networking, but through like webs of relationships, being able to say, hey, we tried this option for dealing with X. I don't know if it will work in your spot, but we could teach you how it works. So I think that coordination comes, and I don't mean this in a romantic way, I mean this in like a very pragmatic way, through building those relationships, right? And getting and sort of having like a each one teach one way of approaching things. So if you know, for instance, Ali, that there's someone who's located outside the UK who has been practicing X or is looking to learn Y, but you can connect them with someone in London who knows how to do that thing. And then the person in London is not just like, oh, here's how you do it, but rather is like, tell me more about your context. Tell me what's happening. Here's what we're doing here. And then you can think together about bridging that context, right? So again, it's not about having an expert. It's more about having someone who's done something, learn about a context, think about what they do, and then think across those things together. I think a lot of it, the last thing I'll say on this is just that I think a lot of it is hard to manage in a way that's like, there's not like a big database somewhere. I think this is partly what we're thinking about with, like, how do we make things available to people so that they are practically useful? Keeping in mind that everything we make that is also public, makes us targets for repression, right? So sort of having that, and we see that historically, we see it right now. So having that balance, I think, is important. But I think it is about actively seeking out and saying part of our organizing work is sharing this information and then figuring out how to get on the same page so that we may not be all one giant organization. We don't need one massive organization to do it. But if we are thinking about what are our shared considerations, what are our shared practices, what are our shared sort of politics, and then able to build that out and support one another, that's where I think we're able to begin sort of building and coordinating in some way, right? And coordinating.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as Ali said, thank you so much for your generous answer. And it was something you said actually made, I think Mariam says this, which is that community, thinking of community as the people we share resources with. And I would go based on what you said as also infrastructures with, and then building from there. And I think that when I heard that, it was such a transformational sort of thought for me, because we've been talking about community for so long, and often we talk about it as our social and political alliances and things like that. But actually, me sitting in this apartment right now in this flat, like the rest of the people in this building and this area that I live in, like just it really grounded me into like, what can I do here? What is possible? And also what can I sort of learn from and then adapt it to this context, which is very specific as well. So I really appreciate that. I am conscious of time, but I want to ask one final question, and maybe you could just do it in a sentence if that feels possible. But I guess I know that you have over 20 years experience of experimentation in so many different ways, and I guess we have folks on here which who are part of Saturday School and also taking their experiments forward. So maybe just what one piece of advice you might have for those folks, or for anyone else that's initiating or transitioning an experiment towards abolition?
I have two very quick pieces of advice. I mean, advice is a weird thing. This is what I try to do, and this is what I hope to learn from. One is to write down what you're doing. I know it sounds maybe a little bit boring, but that reflection is so critical. I think that we learn through thinking about what's happened. And I also think we learn from getting access to other people's experiments, right? So, like when we talk about building these networks of learning or building these infrastructures, so much of it has to do with really being able to understand how did you do that thing? Like, not like, and then it was magic, but like literally, like what happened? Like, where did you make your photocopies? Like, whatever the thing is, right? So I think there's that piece. And then I think the other is really it's all the stuff we've talked about. It's not being afraid to, quote unquote, fail. And what I mean by that is figuring out where you can take risks that are manageable risks, where you can try things in, ways that people agree to, so you're not taking a risk with someone else's life. And then reflecting on sort of what you've learned through those processes, and then kind of recommitting to a set of principles. I think one thing that we've done with the Skill Up that I never thought would be such a big deal, but I'm noticing it in my own work in the Skill Up as well, is this really straightforward thing we do early on, which has to do with naming the values you want to bring to this practice with someone else. And I'm like, oh, but we do this all the time, like we all know our values. And what's been fascinating about it is that it launches you into a conversation about how you're, like, what the thing might be and how you might actually be rooted in it, right? And so if you say you want to be generous, well, like, why? And what does that mean? And what's that going to mean to us? And does it mean different things to us? And I think that piece has the potential to be sustaining in really, really practical ways. And also probably in more life affirming ways, right? But so those are the two things I'd say. Write it all down or draw it or whatever, make it available, and don't forget, and take those risks and do it in a way that's grounded in taking the time to figure out why you're doing what you're doing with the people you're doing it with.
Amazing. That was such great advice. I'm like nodding vigorously in the background. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It's been such a powerful conversation to close out the series. Thank you, Shana, for the important work that you're doing and for sharing so generously today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. There is a recording of this, which we'll share later. So if you sign up to the Migrants in Culture newsletter, you'll be sent that directly along with the resources that were mentioned. And yeah, thank you so much. We'll see you all soon. Bye.
Nishma, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And thank you, Migrants and Culture. Y'all are amazing. So I appreciate it.